They thought they held all the power. Two cops arresting an elderly black veteran, treating him like just another suspect. But what they didn't know was that he had a grandson. And the moment he made that call to the most lethal Navy SEAL alive, everything changed. There's an old saying in war, never back a lion into a corner. Sergeant Dennis Cole should have remembered that before framing Edward Pops Miles. He should have thought twice before planting evidence on a decorated Vietnam veteran. He should have done his homework before issuing a dirty arrest order. But corruption makes men careless. It makes them forget that some old soldiers never lose their bite. It blinds them to the fact that this particular veteran had spent decades training his grandson, now the military's most feared operator, how to hunt predators who think they're untouchable. Now, as Pops sits calmly in his cell, Jackson Miles' shadow falls over their corrupt little empire. And everyone's about to learn exactly why you never mess with a ghost's family. Before we dive back into the story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is one you definitely won't want to miss. 0. The morning sun streamed through the window of M's diner, casting warm beams of light across the worn leather booths. Edward Pops Miles sat in his usual spot, the corner booth, where he could see both the front entrance and the kitchen door. Old habits from his military days died hard. Even after decades, maintaining tactical awareness was second nature. The rich aroma of coffee and bacon filled the air as Sarah, the new waitress, carefully carried a pot of freshly brewed coffee. The diner buzzed with its usual morning crowd, factory workers grabbing breakfast before their shifts, retirees reading newspapers, and locals catching up on small-town gossip. The clink of silverware and the sizzle of bacon on the grill created a comforting backdrop of familiar sounds. "More coffee, Mr. Miles?" Sarah asked. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for his cup. She was young, barely 20, with a nervousness that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Her blonde hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and her uniform was still crisp and new, unlike the faded ones worn by the veteran waitresses. "Thank you, sweetheart," Pop said warmly, his weathered face crinkling into a kind smile. At 72, he still carried himself with the same quiet strength and dignity that had earned him medals in Vietnam. His salt and pepper hair was cut short in the military style he'd kept for over 50 years, and his posture remained straight and proud. "And please," he added gently, "call me Pops. Everyone does." Sarah managed a small smile, gaining confidence from his grandfatherly kindness. She had only started working at Mims 2 weeks earlier, and Pops had been nothing but encouraging, always leaving generous tips and kind words whenever she stumbled. The bell above the door chimed as Detective Randall Giamark's son walked in. Startled, Sarah jumped, causing the coffee pot to slip from her hands. Hot liquid splashed onto the floor, narrowly missing Pop's shoes. Several customers turned to look, and her face flushed a deep red. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, scrambling for a towel, her hands shaking even more. Tears welled up in her eyes as she dropped to her knees, trying to clean the spill. "No harm done," Pops reassured her, reaching for some napkins to help despite her protests. But he noticed how Sarah kept glancing nervously at Giamark's son, who had taken a seat at the counter. The detective gave a small nod in Pop's direction. They'd known each other for years, sharing countless morning coffees and stories from their time in service. Across town, a different scene was unfolding. A masked man burst through the doors of Wilson's liquor store, gun raised. The robbery was fast and methodical, almost too perfect. Tom Wilson, the 60-year-old store owner, raised his hands slowly as the gunman barked for the register to be emptied. "Don't try anything stupid," the robber warned. His voice was muffled but carried a sharp edge. His movements were quick, calculated. This was no rookie. Within minutes, he had the cash and was backing toward the door, his weapon still aimed at Wilson. Outside, a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates waited. The entire robbery took less than 3 minutes, surgical in execution. The vehicle vanished smoothly into traffic. Wilson reached shakily for his phone but hesitated. Something about the whole event didn't sit right. Something didn't add up. Back at Mez Diner parking lot, 2 plainclothes men moved toward Pop's old blue pickup truck with casual precision. They acted like they belonged there, but their movements were too deliberate. The taller one wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He kept watch while his partner worked with professional precision. Inside the truck, they planted their setup methodically, a gun that matched the one used in the robbery and exactly $2,437 in small bills. The money was arranged to look hastily hidden under the seat, while the gun was placed in the glove compartment, wiped clean of fingerprints, and ready to be discovered. The call came into the station moments later, an anonymous tip about a suspicious vehicle matching the robbery description. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, but Sergeant Dennis Cole was already grabbing his keys before she could finish. A predatory gleam flickered in his pale blue eyes. "Old man Miles," Cole muttered, lips curling into a cruel smile as he reached for his jacket. Other officers in the room exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew Cole's reputation and his history of targeting black residents in their small town. "It's about time we put that old veteran in his place," he said with satisfaction. He had been waiting for an opportunity like this for years, ever since Miles filed the complaint about Cole's mistreatment of young black teens in the neighborhood. "Sir," Officer James Jenkins began hesitantly, concern on his young face. "Shouldn't we verify the—" "Can it, Jenkins?" Cole snapped, spinning toward the rookie with barely restrained fury. "I want a full tactical response. This suspect is considered armed and dangerous. Or would you rather explain to the chief why you're questioning a senior officer's orders?" Jenkins fell silent, but the discomfort was written all over his face. Around the station, other officers busied themselves with paperwork, deliberately avoiding eye contact. They had seen this all before: Cole's vendettas, his abuse of power. But in a small town where speaking up could end your career, silence had become a survival strategy. Inside Ms. Diner, Pops was finishing his breakfast when his phone buzzed a text from his old friend Reggie. "Cops moving your way." "Something's wrong." Reggie was homeless, but he saw everything from his usual spot near the courthouse. Pops had been sharing meals with him for years, ever since discovering they'd served in the same unit back in '68. The message made Pops pause. He'd long since learned to trust Reggie's instincts that had saved both their lives more than once in the jungle. His eyes scanned the diner, noting exits, customer positions, potential threats. Nothing appeared out of place, but there was a tension in the air, the kind you feel just before things explode. He stood slowly, left exact change on the table along with his usual generous tip for Sarah. His movements were calm, but purposeful, as he walked toward the door. Detective Giamark's son watched him go, a strange unease curling in his gut. He'd known Pops too long to ignore the deliberate way the old soldier moved. Something was definitely wrong. The morning calm shattered as 3 police cruisers screeched into the parking lot, blocking every possible escape route. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting conflicting orders that echoed off the diner windows. Inside, customers pressed against the glass, phones raised to record. "Hands where we can see them. Get on the ground. Don't move." Pop slowly lowered himself to his knees, hands raised. His face remained calm, almost detached, as if observing it all from a distance. But that wasn't enough for Cole. He charged forward and shoved Pop's face first onto the pavement. The rough asphalt scraped his cheek as Cole yanked his arms back, cuffing him with unnecessary force. "You're under arrest," Cole growled, but never even finished reading him his rights. His knee dug into Pop's back with excessive pressure, drawing a slight grunt of pain from the old man. "Stop. He's a veteran." Reggie emerged from between 2 parked cars, his military bearing unmistakable despite his ragged clothes, though his jacket was threadbare and his beard marking. His posture still reflected a soldier's discipline. This man served his country. He has rights. An officer responded with a brutal elbow to Reggie's gut, doubling him over. "Stay in the gutter where you belong, old man," he snapped. Reggie collapsed to his knees, struggling to breathe, as other officers moved to push back the growing crowd of onlookers. From the shadows of a nearby alley, a sleek black SUV idled silently. Inside, Mikhail Volkov watched the scene unfold through tinted windows. His fingers, heavy with gold rings, tapped a number on his phone. The interior smelled of expensive leather and faint traces of imported cigarettes. "The trap is set," he said quietly, his Russian accent barely noticeable after decades in America. Miles took the bait perfectly. "Everything is proceeding according to plan." He ended the call with a slight smile, watching Pops being shoved into the back of a squad car. Inside the cruiser, Pops remained eerily calm. His eyes scanned constantly, noting details others would miss: badge numbers, name tags, faces. The same military training that had kept him alive in the jungle was now serving a new purpose. He noticed how Officer Jenkins looked away in shame, how Detective Giamark's son stood apart from the others, his posture radiating doubt. Giamark's son had known Pops for 15 years. They had shared countless morning coffees at Ms., trading stories from their service days. Something about this arrest didn't add up, and G. Mark's son knew it. The detective watched as Cole's men discovered the evidence in Pop's truck, but the movements were too rehearsed, their surprise too well practiced to be genuine. Inside the diner, Sarah watched through the window, tears streaming down her face. She had seen scenes like this before in another town, at another job. It was the reason uniforms made her nervous, why her hands shook every time police were around. May, the diner's owner, gently placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. "That ain't right," May muttered, her lined face tight with anger. "That man's been coming in here every morning for 10 years, never caused a lick of trouble. Something's not right about this at all." That night, in a private room at the Blue Line, a bar frequented by cops, Cole and his crew celebrated. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp smell of cheap whiskey. Laughter filled the room as they bragged about how easy it had been, how perfectly everything had fallen into place. Cole held court at the center table, his face flushed with alcohol and false triumph. "Did you see how calm he tried to act?" Cole mocked, taking another long drink. "All that dignity, well, dignity won't help him where he's going." The others laughed, but the sound was forced, uncomfortable. None of them noticed Rookie Officer Marcus Dean quietly slipping out early, his face pale with disgust. When they threw Pops into a holding cell, he didn't resist. He didn't argue or plead. Instead, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that made the guards uneasy. His voice was quiet, but it echoed clearly down the concrete corridor. "You boys just made the worst mistake of your lives." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. One of the younger guards shifted nervously, but his partner scoffed. Tough talk for an old man facing serious charges. In his cell, Pop sat upright on the hard bench, his back straight and his head high. He was already thinking about the phone call he would soon make and the storm it would unleash on this corrupt little town. His grandson had inherited both his smile and his talent for making people regret their choices. The last light of day faded through the tiny window, just as a black SUV quietly pulled away from the police station. Inside, Mikhail Volkov made another call. "Phase 1 is complete. Prepare for his arrival," he said calmly, his slight Russian accent barely audible after decades in America. "Yes, everything must be ready when the grandson comes, and he will come. This isn't just about some old man anymore. This is about luring out a ghost." The SUV disappeared into the gathering darkness as night fell over the town. Back in his cell, Pops closed his eyes, but he wasn't sleeping. He was counting hours, recalling a phone number he'd memorized years ago, one he'd never needed until now. At the nearly empty police station, the night shift settled in, expecting a quiet evening. None of them realized the real storm was only just beginning. None of them understood they hadn't just arrested an old man. They had sparked a war. And wars have a way of burning everything in their path. In his office, Detective G. Mark's son sat alone, staring at old photos of himself and Pops at various veterans' events. His gut told him this was wrong. All of it. But in a town this small, standing up to Cole meant risking more than just your badge, it meant risking everything. Still, as he looked at those photos, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far bigger than a frame-up was underway, something that would change their quiet little town forever. And somewhere in the dark, a phone was about to ring, carrying the message that would set it all in motion. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the interrogation room as Pop sat perfectly still, his weathered hands folded calmly on the metal table. The clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m., but Pop showed no sign of fatigue. It had been 20 hours since his arrest. They'd tried everything: good cop, bad cop, threats, promises, but nothing cracked his calm exterior. "Let's try this one more time, old man," Detective Edward Foster said as he slapped a file down on the table, his frustration showing in every movement. "The gun matches the robbery. The money matches the robbery. Your truck was ID'd at the scene. Just confess, make it easier on yourself." Pops didn't even blink. "You know what we used to do in Vietnam when we caught someone planting evidence?" His voice was soft, almost conversational. "We'd wait, just wait. Because sooner or later they always made a mistake." Then he smiled and left the sentence unfinished. Foster's face reddened, but before he could reply, the door opened and Sergeant Cole walked in, filling the small room with an almost suffocating tension. "Give us the room," Cole said. Foster nodded and left, leaving Cole alone with Pops. Cole sat across from him, leaning forward, his breath reeking of booze and bitterness. "You're not in your fancy jungle anymore, soldier," he sneered. "This is my town, My rules. Stale coffee and cigarettes. Confessor, I make sure you disappear. Lots of old men have accidents in jail. Pops finally moved, tilting his head slightly as he studied Cole. You remind me of a sergeant I knew in '68. Same kind of swagger, same kind of threats. His eyes never left Cole's face. Want to know what happened to him? Cole slammed his hand on the table. One phone call. That's all you get. Make it count. Because after that you're in the system, and the system, it swallows men like you whole. They led Pops to a phone mounted on the wall, its cord shortened to prevent any attempts at using it as a weapon. He dialed a number from memory, one he kept in his head for years but never used. As it rang, he could feel Cole watching, waiting for some sign of weakness. Halfway across the world, in a remote location that didn't officially exist, Jackson Miles was preparing for an operation. At 34, he was already a legend in circles where legends were rare and usually dead. His team was gearing up to eliminate a warlord who'd been selling weapons to terrorist cells. The secured satellite phone in his pocket vibrated. Only 3 people had that number. 2 of them were in the room with him. The third, grandfather. Jackson. His voice was sharp, alert. Pops never called. Never. Remember when you were 10 and those boys stole your bike? Pop's voice was calm, measured. Remember what I told you about handling bullies? Jackson's hand tightened on the phone. It was their code, established years ago. Corrupt authority, immediate danger. I'm coming. Hold on. Love you, son. The line went dead. Jackson turned to his team, his face set in stone. Mission scrubbed. Family emergency. Before anyone could respond, he was already moving, stripping off his tactical gear. You can't just walk away from this. His commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell, stepped in his path. This operation has been planned for months. Watch me. Jackson's voice was soft but carried an edge that made hardened soldiers step back. You've got 2 choices: grant me emergency leave or I go AWOL. Either way, I'm leaving. The other members of SEAL Team 6 watched in silence. They'd seen Jackson in action. He knew what he was capable of. Some called him a ghost, the way he could appear and disappear in the field, the way targets would drop without a sound. Now they saw something else in his eyes, something that made even Mitchell pause. 24 hours, Mitchell finally said. After that, I can't protect you. Jackson was already walking away. I don't need protection. They do. Back in the police station, FBI agent Evel Brooks sat in her car, listening to the encrypted police channels through specialized equipment. She'd been tracking a pattern of corruption across several small towns, following a trail of dirty money and dead witnesses. When she heard about Pop's arrest, something clicked. Running facial recognition now, she spoke into her recorder. Edward Miles, decorated Vietnam veteran. Multiple commendations for valor. 1 grandson. She paused, staring at her screen. Most of Jackson's file was redacted, but what she could see made her sit up straighter. Oh, this just got interesting. Inside the station, Officer Marcus Dean stood in the evidence room, staring at the gun they'd found in Pop's truck. His hand shook as he picked it up, noting details that didn't add up. The serial number had been filed off recently. He could still see metal shavings. And the money. Admiring our handiwork. Officer Mark Steele's voice made Dean jump. The older cop stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. Word of advice, rookie: some things you don't want to look too closely at. Some things you pretend you never saw. This isn't right. Dean's voice was barely a whisper. He's innocent. Steele moved faster than Dean expected, pinning him against the wall. Listen carefully. You've got a nice future ahead of you, beautiful wife, baby on the way. Be ashamed if something happened to them because you couldn't keep your mouth shut. Dean felt the fight drain out of him. I understand. Good boy, Steele released him. Now put that back exactly where you found it, and remember, accidents happen to heroes too. In a penthouse suite overlooking the city, Mikhail Volkov hosted a private meeting. The room spoke of old money and refined taste: Persian rugs, antique furniture, crystal decanters filled with expensive scotch. His guests were men of influence: Congressman Clark Price, Police Commissioner Harold Crane, and CEO Richard Foster of Foster Development Corporation. The grandfather was necessary, Volkov explained, pouring drinks. The real target is the grandson. For years, he's been a thorn in our side, disrupting operations across 3 continents. Now he'll come to us. This seems excessive for one man. Congressman Price swirled his scotch nervously. The risk is calculated, Volkov cut him off. Jackson Miles isn't just any operator, he's a ghost. The most lethal Navy SEAL. Alive. But even ghosts become vulnerable when family is involved. Commissioner Crane leaned forward. My men can handle one soldier. Volkov's laugh was cold. Your men? They're not even speed bumps to someone like him. No, we have other arrangements in place, professional contractors. Ex-military, the best money can buy. And the old man? Foster asked. Once Miles arrives, he'll have an unfortunate accident in his cell. Volkov's smile didn't reach his eyes. A tragedy, really. The stress of false accusations leading to a heart attack. These things happen. On a military transport plane somewhere over the Atlantic, Jackson sat alone checking his phone. Messages were already coming in from his network, other operators, intelligence assets, people who owed him favors. In 6 hours, he'd have everything he needed, building layouts, patrol schedules, personnel files. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. 2 hours to touchdown, sir. Jackson closed his eyes, but not to sleep. He was remembering weekends at his grandfather's house, learning tracking, survival skills, how to read people. Pops had known. Somehow he had known that his grandson would need these skills. Known that one day something like this might happen. Hang on, Pops, he whispered. I'm coming. Back in his cell, Pops sat on his bunk reading a worn paperback book he'd been allowed to keep. Other inmates watched him curiously. Most men his age would be breaking down by now, but he seemed almost peaceful. Another prisoner called out from 2 cells down. Hey, old Drew, what you in for? Pops turned a page without looking up. Waiting. Waiting for what? A what? Now Pops did look up, and something in his expression made the other man step back from his bars. You ever see what happens when you back a lion into a corner? The question hung in the air, heavy with promise. Down the corridor, a guard shifted uncomfortably, remembering stories from Vietnam. Stories about men like Miles who'd survived things that would break most people. In her office at the FBI field office, Agent Brooks was building a wall of connections, photos, documents, bank records, all pointing to something bigger than the simple false arrest. She traced wire transfers from offshore accounts, all leading back to shell companies with Russian connections. Her phone buzzed a contact at the Pentagon. You need to back off this one, Lydia, the voice warned. Miles' grandson, he's not someone you want to get tangled up with. Why? She pressed. What makes him so special? A long pause. Let's just say there's a reason certain missions don't exist on paper, and he's usually the reason why. Brooks hung up, staring at her evidence wall. Something bigger was coming. She could feel it in her bones. Detective G. Mark's son sat in his car outside the station, wrestling with his conscience. He'd known Pops for years, shared countless cups of coffee, listened to stories about his grandson, never anything specific, just proud grandfather talk. But now his phone rang. His wife, Amanda. Honey, there are men watching the house. They say they're police. But G. Mark's son's blood ran cold. Take Tommy and go to your sister's, now. Don't pack. Don't ask questions. Just go. What's happening? I don't know, he admitted. But whatever it is, it's bigger than we thought. In the evidence room, Dean sat alone, staring at his phone. On the screen was a draft email to Internal Affairs detailing everything he'd seen. His finger hovered over the send button as Steele's threats echoed in his mind. A noise made him look up. Standing in the doorway was Cole, his face twisted in a sneer. Making a mistake, rookie? Dean quickly pocketed his phone. No, sir, just checking inventory. Smart boy. Cole's smile was all teeth. Remember, loyalty is everything in this job. Everything. In this job, everything. As night fell over the city, different players moved into position. Zodov dug up surveillance points around key locations. Corrupt cops altered patrol schedules to ensure certain areas would be unmonitored. Money changed hands, threats were made, and pieces fell into place. In his penthouse, Volkov received another call. The package is in motion. 8 hours until touchdown. Perfect. He hung up and walked to his window, looking out over the city he'd spent years corrupting. Come to us, ghost. Come and meet your end. What none of them knew, what none of them could know, was that they weren't just inviting one man into their trap, they were inviting destruction. Because Jackson Miles hadn't earned his reputation by playing by others' rules. At the airport in Dubai, Jackson boarded his connection to the States. A flight attendant noticed how still he sat, how his eyes constantly scanned the cabin. She'd seen soldiers before. Her brother was in the Marines, but this was different. This man wasn't just alert. He was hunting. In his cell, Pop smiled slightly as lights out was called. He meant what he said about waiting for mistakes. Already he could see the cracks forming: coalesce arrogance, steel s. Some people believe that a badge gives them the right to abuse their power. These officers thought they could arrest an elderly black veteran, showing him no respect, treating him unfairly. But what they didn't realize, this veteran wasn't alone. He calmly picked up his phone, dialed a single number, and said just a few words. On the other end, his grandson. But not just any grandson, the most lethal Navy SEAL alive. Within minutes, everything changed. The officers who once felt untouchable began to panic. They saw the look on the veteran's face. He wasn't scared. He wasn't begging. He was waiting. And soon they realized their mistake. This wasn't just about a wrongful arrest. This was a moment of justice, a reminder that no one, not even the ones with power, is above consequences. Because sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who teach you the biggest lesson. Through this story, we not only witness a confrontation between right and wrong, but we also come to understand the power of courage, perseverance, and family bonds. It reminds us that justice does not always come from the system. Sometimes it comes from those who dare to stand up for what is right, even when faced with injustice and danger. The message here is clear: power is not a license to abuse, and silence in the face of wrongdoing only allows it to persist longer. So what can we do? In this year, 2025, each of us can begin by changing our mindset and teaching our children about respect, equality, and human dignity. Let's live with more kindness, listen more, and most importantly, have the courage to speak up when we witness injustice, whether online or in real life. If everyone contributes just a little, step by step, society will begin to change. Will racism still exist by the year 2030? Honestly, I don't think it will completely disappear. But I believe that if we persist in planting the right values today, the next generation will live in a world that is more just and compassionate than the one we have known. And sometimes it's the seemingly small things of brave action, a timely word, that can bring about the greatest change. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of accountability, justice, and the importance of treating all individuals with dignity and respect. We strongly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.